The other thing that we've been assuming up to this point is that we have no energy input or energy output of the system. There's no energy being added or lost. No energy being gained or lost by our system. In real life, there is friction, there is air resistance. So those are things that we would then have to deal with. So let's take, for example, a mass spring system that has some kind of damping force that is proportional to velocity. Then our net force is minus kx minus bv, which is our resistive force, whatever that might be, equals ma. Rewriting this in differential form, you have, it's kind of complicated because you have a first derivative of position and a second derivative of position in the same equation. So I'm not going to justify this, except that if you plug this answer in, you'll realize that it works. You'll study these more advanced differential equations in college if you continue on with calculus. That's usually the fourth class, kind of Calc 4, is differential equations. But the solution to this differential equation is exponential, so it has some initial amplitude. It's a decaying exponential. The system is going to slowly return to equilibrium, and then it also oscillates back and forth like a normal system does. This equation won't appear on the AP exam. It won't appear on a test or quiz. I'll ask you, actually it might appear on a quiz. It won't appear on a test. And I'll give it to you for your quiz if you need it. But a calculation with this equation won't appear on the AP exam. I just want to note what the equation, show you what the equation is, so we can take a look at what it looks like. What is worth noting is that the angular frequency is affected when there is damping. So that was actually a minor source of error in our lab, that when you're measuring the period of the mass and spring that we're oscillating, there is air resistance, which does slightly change the frequency and therefore period of the oscillations. So this is the angular frequency of a damped oscillation is square root of k over m, which is just what the undamped system is, then minus b over 2m squared. So the angular frequency is decreased by damping. B is just called the damping constant. It's a measure of how much force there is that's slowing this down. So the angular frequency of a damped system is going to be smaller than the angular frequency of the undamped system, which means it will have a larger period. Oscillations will take longer. Depending on the value of B, a system can be underdamped, overdamped, or critically damped. I didn't mean for that to jump onto the next page, I think. So an underdamped oscillator is probably the most interesting. This happens when B over 2m is less than what the angular frequency of the system would be without damping, which we call omega naught. Omega naught is equal to root k over m, so it's what the angular frequency of the system would be if there was no damping. And what happens here is that the oscillator oscillates, but with decreasing amplitude. An overdamped oscillator, this happens when B over 2m is greater than omega naught. The oscillator, well, it's no longer an oscillator because the oscillator doesn't oscillate. It just returns to equilibrium. It never passes the equilibrium position of the mass spring system. A critically damped oscillator occurs when B over 2m equals omega naught, and this does the same thing as an overdamped oscillator. It returns to equilibrium in the least possible time. That's actually interesting. If the system has more damping, it will actually return to equilibrium more slowly than it would if you have just the right amount of damping. The idea of critical damping is something that's used in cars. You may know cars have a spring system. Actually, I talked about that in class, so you should know cars have a spring system that holds up the body of the car. It's called shocks on the car, and the idea is for those shocks to create a critically damped system, so when the car bounces, it then returns to equilibrium in the shortest possible time. What this looks like graphically, the underdamped system is most interesting. The function has this decaying exponential attached to the cosine, which means the amplitude decreases like a decaying exponential. So you go down, and it kind of does something like this, where if you sort of connect the dots on the maxima, you get a decaying exponential on both sides. So that is an underdamped system. And then an overdamped, this is a displacement as a function of time. An overdamped system starts here and just goes, it just goes straight back to equilibrium. And then, again, a critically damped system the graph looks pretty much the same as an overdamped system. It just does it faster. It goes down to equilibrium more quickly than does the overdamped system. The overdamped system takes a little bit longer. Yeah, so you should know, just so you know, there are some problems on your homework that do some calculations with this. For the AP exam, you just need to know the concept of damping and the different kinds of damping. You don't actually need to know any calculational stuff. Forced oscillations, also known as driven oscillations, is when you're putting energy into a system. This is common because anything that involves an oscillator in real life, there is some kind of air resistance or friction or whatever, and so the system will slow down. So there needs to be some kind of energy input to keep the system moving. This is why, for example, old grandfather clocks that ran off of a pendulum, you did have to wind them. You're winding a flywheel to store energy, and that energy is gradually released to keep the pendulum swinging. After a while, you need to wind it. Again, it is common for a forced oscillation to vary sinusoidally, so that the force is equal to, some, call it F naught, which is like the amplitude of the force, kind of, sine omega t. The resulting system is fairly complicated, but the amplitude of oscillation is given by this big old nasty equation, which is this. Ooh, isn't that intense? All right, so F naught is this, omega is this, omega naught is the natural frequency of the system. So there is a driving force that varies sinusoidally. That omega is this one. Omega naught is the natural frequency of the system. If it was a mass spring system, then you'd plug in root k over m, so that'd become just k over m when it got squared. And b, again, is the damping constant. Omega is omega, and m is the mass. So this is the amplitude of a system where there is a driving force and where there is damping. Now, the only reason that I am giving you this equation is to point out this part of it here, that the smaller this value is, the smaller the denominator is, and therefore the bigger the whole amplitude is. So if the force is inputting energy at the same frequency as the system, you get really big amplitudes of oscillation. And this is what happened with the Tacoma Narrows. There was a bridge that was made. Those of you that have taken my class before have seen this video. But there was a bridge that was made back in the 50s, I want to say, that had a serious effect on, and it was a suspension bridge, and on days when the wind was high, wind doesn't blow constantly, it kind of gusts, and it just so happened that that wind was gusting at what was the natural frequency of the bridge itself, and so it started swaying with absurdly large amplitudes, and that eventually caused the bridge to collapse. If you look that up, I will post video lecture.